We crew felt the weight of the world on our shoulders. We knew that everyone would be looking at us.
Tonight, we want to remember Michael Collins, who may have had the toughest job on Apollo 11.
Just before his passing in 2021, Michael Collins, Apollo 11's often overlooked third astronaut, finally spoke up about what he saw during those silent, solitary hours while orbiting the moon, something he'd kept hidden all these years. As Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin made history on the lunar surface, Michael was alone, on the far side, facing something entirely his own. Tune in as his haunting final admission about what he saw could forever change how we see the Apollo 11 mission. The unseen side of Apollo 11. Imagine being completely alone in space, orbiting the moon, with no connection to Earth, just endless silence and an infinite view of stars. This is what Michael Collins, an often overlooked hero of the Apollo 11 mission, experienced. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became famous for stepping onto the moon, Michael was the one orbiting alone, making sure they could all return safely. But what if, in those lonely hours, he encountered something that shook him deeply, something he felt he had to share years later, a truth NASA had kept quiet? But what if, in that silence, he saw something unimaginable, something he couldn't reveal until years later, a truth NASA hid from the world? Michael Collins, the astronaut often overshadowed by his legendary Apollo 11 crewmates, carried a secret, a truth that he only chose to reveal before his death. This secret, hidden from the public eye for decades, would change how we see that iconic mission. What was it that he finally admitted? And why did he keep it hidden for so long? He was known as the man who stayed behind while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took humanity's first steps on the moon. But his story, the part that went untold, is far more profound than anyone knew. Imagine the isolation of being alone in lunar orbit, with nothing but silence and the vast, cold darkness of space surrounding you. Was this silence where he uncovered something deeper, something unspeakable? Born on October 31st, 1930 in Rome, his life was shaped by the shadow of great responsibilities. His father was a major general in the U.S. Army, and from a young age he was trained in the values of duty, discipline, and courage. But those values would be tested in ways no one could have foreseen when he became part of the Apollo mission. Growing up, he moved from place to place, Italy, Puerto Rico, the United States, experiencing cultures from all over the world. He developed a fascination with flying early on, a fascination fueled by the stories of aviators like Charles Lindbergh. His dreams soared high, but none could have predicted just how far he would actually go, or how alone he would end up feeling in the vastness of space. He was a dedicated student, especially in science, and he knew he wanted to fly. He enrolled in the United States Military Academy at West Point and graduated near the top of his class in 1952. His military training sharpened his skills, but it was only the beginning of a journey that would take him to the very edge of human experience. After West Point, he chose the Air Force, driven by his need to fly the most advanced aircraft of the time. It was at Columbus Air Force Base where he earned his wings and where his journey really took off. But even as he pushed forward, the idea of space, the final frontier, called to him like a whisper he couldn't ignore. Stationed at George Air Force Base, he flew the F-86 Sabre, a fighter jet used in the Korean War. This was thrilling, but it was also dangerous. He lost friends along the way, friends whose memories stayed with him long after their missions ended. These experiences gave him a deep respect for the fragility of life, and perhaps planted the seeds for the secret he would eventually carry. In 1960, he took another step toward the stars. He was accepted into the U.S. Air Force Experimental Flight Test Pilot School. Here, at Edwards Air Force Base, he learned to push the boundaries of aviation. Among the projects was the infamous X-15, a rocket-powered plane that could touch the very edge of space. These daring flights weren't just tests of the technology, they were tests of spirit. He began to look beyond Earth's atmosphere, his eyes set on the stars. When NASA announced its astronaut selection process, he knew he had to apply. But the first time in 1962, he wasn't chosen. It was a disappointment, but he wasn't the kind of man to give up. He applied again, and in 1963, his persistence paid off. He was selected as part of NASA's third group of astronauts. His dreams were beginning to align with destiny. The Gemini program was his entry into space, a crucial stepping stone on the path to the moon. In 1966, he flew in Gemini 10. It was an intense mission, and he became the first astronaut to conduct 2 spacewalks. The exhaustion, the isolation, the feeling of floating in the unknown, these were experiences that few could understand. But they were also moments of revelation. What did he see out there, alone in the dark void? Originally, he was supposed to be part of Apollo 8, but an injury forced him to take a step back. After a successful recovery, he found himself on the Apollo 11 mission, assigned as the command module pilot. His role was different. While Armstrong and Aldrin went to the lunar surface, he would stay behind in the command module Columbia. He would be alone, circling the moon, cut off from Earth and even from his crew, completely isolated. Imagine being the sole human on the far side of the moon. No contact, no connection, just the emptiness of space. For 47 minutes on each orbit, he was on his own, completely cut off from all of humanity. What thoughts crossed his mind in those moments? Did he discover something about the universe, about himself, that he could not put into words? In interviews after the mission, he often described his time alone in positive terms. He talked about enjoying the quiet, the beauty of the moon, and the Earth hanging in the distance. But as the years went on, hints of something deeper began to emerge. He spoke of a strange presence he felt during those long, lonely orbits. Was it merely his imagination? Or was it something more, a realization about the universe, a connection that defied explanation? It wasn't until late in his life, as he looked back on those days, that he finally spoke openly about what he had felt. The feeling of being watched, the sense that he wasn't truly alone. He described it as a presence, something that was there with him, even when no one else was. Was it the weight of his own thoughts, amplified by the vast emptiness of space? Or was it something more mysterious, something that science could not explain? His story is often overshadowed by the triumphant moon landing, but his experience, the solitude, the strange feelings, the profound reflections, is a reminder that space exploration is not just about technology or science. It's also about the human spirit, about confronting the unknown and coming to terms with the vast mysteries that lie beyond our world. What did he truly see during those lonely hours in lunar orbit? Was it just the shadows of his own mind, or did he touch on something far deeper, a secret that he carried with him until his final days? Perhaps, in the end, the real mystery of Apollo 11 is not just what happened on the surface of the moon, but what happened in the silence of space, with only him and the stars. The mystery surrounding the event might remain unsolved indefinitely. Michael's last statement on the incident stirred curiosity and unease. He had expressed a sensation of encountering an unexplainable presence, something beyond the grasp of ordinary understanding. This declaration led to a myriad of speculations and discussions. People wondered what it was that Michael had experienced. Could it be something supernatural, or merely a trick of the mind brought on by stress or the environment? His words painted a picture of a man touched by something extraordinary, something that defied explanation and left more questions than answers. As the story of his experience spread, it captured the imaginations of many, prompting them to ponder the vast unknowns of human experience. And maybe, just maybe, some things are meant to stay beyond our understanding. A countdown to history. The years before Apollo 11 were filled with some of the most demanding training NASA had ever conducted. Michael Collins, alongside Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, spent countless hours in simulators. They practiced every single part of the mission, from weightlessness to docking and re-entry. These sessions weren't just drills, they were painstaking rehearsals for making history. Every second of their training was meant to prepare them for the unknown, ensuring they could handle anything that came their way. Imagine being on the brink of something no human had ever done before. Collins knew the stakes. Each practice run, every stressful situation simulated, mattered for a successful outcome. Would all this training pay off, or would the unforgiving space prove too great a challenge? The command module held a unique place for him. While Neil and Buzz would take the lunar leap, he would be alone, orbiting the moon, ready to ensure their safe return. His skills as a test pilot had prepared him for critical, split-second decisions, but nothing could completely ready him for the sense of isolation or the weight of responsibility he would soon feel. The astronauts underwent grueling physical training. Exercise became a discipline, building strength and stamina. Their bodies had to endure space travel's rigors: zero gravity, tight quarters, and hours strapped in place. Collins followed a strict regimen, determined to make sure he was at peak physical condition for the mission ahead. A major part of the preparation also lay in mission planning, a painstaking process of charting out each moment of the journey. Together with flight directors and engineers, he helped craft a schedule that accounted for every possible detail. From countdown to splashdown, they needed to know what every second held. He was also instrumental in understanding every part of the command module's operations. He wasn't just an astronaut, he was a technician, a problem solver. He had to be. While his fellow astronauts walked on the moon, he needed to maintain the systems that would get them all home. He was their lifeline in orbit, their lone support while they were beyond help. Then there were the training simulations, grueling and unpredictable. They recreated every challenge, from simple technical glitches to full-blown crises. Collins had to practice navigating the vast void of space, reconnecting with the lunar module, even imagining the unimaginable, an Apollo mission ending in failure. But the challenge wasn't just physical. The mental aspect was as critical as anything else. Psychologists evaluated the crew constantly, gauging how they would handle the long, tense days in space. For him, his mission meant enduring stretches of solitude while orbiting the moon, knowing he was alone, his communication with Earth dropping out with every pass behind the lunar surface. His calm, reflective demeanor turned this isolation into something more profound. Instead of fearing the silence, he embraced it, a moment to contemplate the bigger picture, the mission, the unknown. His relationship with Neil and Buzz was forged in this crucible, built on trust and a mutual understanding of the stakes. They weren't just crewmates, they were each other's lifelines. Imagine spending days studying every nut and bolt of the command module. He did just that. He had to know it all, not just how to operate it, but how to fix it if something went wrong. He drilled down into the guidance systems and communication channels. He knew that a small failure could mean disaster. Would all this knowledge be enough when faced with the real thing? And communication, the very lifeline between him, the lunar surface, and Earth. It was his job to ensure that every word between mission control and the astronauts was heard. One missed call could lead to catastrophe. Each training session involved making sure lines stayed open, that voices were heard, and no message was lost in the void. In those final days before launch, the astronauts isolated themselves, running through final rehearsals, checking and rechecking equipment. They entered quarantine, sealing themselves away from any possible illness that could jeopardize the mission. This was it. Every practice, every sacrifice, every fear brought them to this final step. And then came July 16th, 1969. The roar of the Saturn V rocket launching from Kennedy Space Center was deafening. Collins, Neil, and Buzz sat strapped in, feeling the powerful thrust push them skyward. The vibrations were overwhelming, the noise deafening, but they held on. Traveling at over 17,000 miles per hour, they watched the Earth shrink behind them. The curve of the blue planet seemed almost surreal, a reminder of just how small humanity was in the vastness of space. After a brief orbit, they prepared for the translunar injection, the moment that would set them on their way to the moon. It required precise timing, a moment of trust between the crew and mission control. 3 days passed, and Apollo 11 approached the moon. Collins monitored their path closely, every adjustment made carefully to ensure they stayed true. They couldn't afford a mistake. The lunar orbit was next, another nerve-wracking moment of engine burns and adjustments. It was a delicate dance to catch the moon's gravitational pull. Would everything work as planned? Once in lunar orbit, he prepared to do what no human had done before: watch as his two companions descended to the lunar surface while he stayed above. It was a moment he had trained for, a role he accepted without question, but one that would leave him alone in space, a silent observer to history. As Neil and Buzz took their first steps on the lunar surface, he floated alone above. The command module orbited, sometimes passing out of contact with Earth, the silence of space all-encompassing. He was the forgotten man, but he knew his part was just as vital. Could he keep the module steady, systems functional, communications open? Would his role, his isolation, be remembered? In the end, Collins's confession came years later, shortly before his death. What did he finally admit? It wasn't regret, not for staying behind, not for missing the walk on the moon. No, his admission was simpler, more profound. He spoke of the beauty of solitude, of how, in those hours alone orbiting the moon, he felt a deep connection to humanity, to everyone on that tiny blue marble far away. The vastness of space made him feel closer to Earth than ever before. Was that what he had always wanted to share, but never found the words? Michael Collins didn't step foot on the moon, but he found something that no one else did. In his solitude, he discovered a profound sense of unity, a realization that while he was one man alone in the vastness, he was also connected to all of us, everyone watching from Earth, holding their breath. It was a story of being alone yet never feeling lonely, of fulfilling a role that history often forgets, but one that was just as essential as the steps taken on the lunar surface. Would we ever fully understand what it meant to be the man who watched from above, the one who saw it all yet stayed in the shadows? Michael Collins left us with that mystery, a story half told, a feeling that perhaps the greatest moments are not always the ones that make the headlines. Beyond fame. From where he stood, Neil could see the moon's surface in breathtaking detail. It stretched out in front of him, an endless expanse of rough, empty land. Deep craters and towering mountains cast long, inky shadows. The sunlight was harsh, lighting every detail, making the moon seem both beautiful and strangely menacing. There was a profound stillness outside, broken only by their own breathing and the gentle hum of the spacecraft. It was a scene unlike anything he had ever witnessed, a vivid reminder of how far they were from home. With the spacecraft in a steady orbit, it was time for Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to prepare the lunar module, called the Eagle, for its descent to the moon's surface. This was no simple task. Every detail mattered, for the Eagle needed to separate from the command module with precision. It had to be aligned perfectly for the landing. The success of the mission depended on this very moment, and each decision had to be made with care. Neil and Buzz worked through their checklist, their eyes scanning every switch, every light, and every control. There could be no mistakes. If something went wrong, it could jeopardize not only their landing, but also their return. Imagine being on a journey where every breath, every step could determine success or failure. That was their reality. There was no room for error. They moved with quiet determination, aware that they were on the brink of making history. Back on Earth, millions were watching, holding their breath, waiting to see if they could do what had never been done before. The pressure was enormous, but they remained focused on the task. All that mattered was sticking to the plan, taking each step carefully. As they began their descent, Michael Collins remained in the command module, orbiting the moon alone. His task was different, less visible perhaps, but just as important. He had to keep the command module functioning, stay in contact with both the Earth and the Eagle, and prepare for the return of his fellow astronauts. It was a lonely job, demanding both mental focus and resilience. Neil and Buzz made their historic landing, stepping onto the lunar surface for the first time. While they walked on the moon, Michael orbited above, making sure everything was ready for when they returned. When the time came to reunite, the docking maneuver was tense. It had to be done with absolute precision, or they risked being left behind. Michael ensured everything went smoothly, and soon the three astronauts were together again, ready to make the journey back home. The journey back was calm, giving the astronauts a chance to reflect. Michael kept up with his tasks, but found moments to consider what they had accomplished. Soon, Earth appeared larger in the window, growing as they approached. But one last test lay ahead, the re-entry to Earth's atmosphere. It was Michael who had to position the command module just right for the descent. The wrong angle could mean disaster, burning up or bouncing off into space. As they sped through the sky, the heat shield faced temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But everything went as planned, and Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969. Michael Collins returned to Earth as a hero, but unlike Neil and Buzz, he preferred to step away from the spotlight. He chose a quieter path. In 1970, he left NASA, seeking more time with his family. He briefly worked in public service, but it wasn't the same as the thrill of space. He eventually became the director of the National Air and Space Museum, turning it into a celebrated landmark that told the story of human flight, from the earliest planes to the journey into space. Michael took pride in teaching others about aviation and space. Later, he worked as an aerospace consultant and wrote books about his experiences. His memoir, Carrying the Fire, is still praised for its honest and thoughtful perspective. He enjoyed his privacy, spending time outdoors, fishing, and hiking, simple activities that brought peace after the adventure of space. Did Michael witness something extraordinary on the moon's far side? Or was it just the solitude playing tricks? Share your theories in the comments, like, and subscribe for more.